Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the late afternoon sun paint golden stripes across her modest backyard. At 62, she'd learned to find peace in small moments like these. The way light caught on the leaves of her herb garden, the familiar weight of her wooden spoon as she stirred the pot of stew simmering on the stove. Sunday dinners had become sacred to her in the 5 years since Thomas passed. Not because the food was particularly fancy, or because her home was large and impressive. No, these gatherings mattered because they were the threads that kept her connected to the person she loved most in this world. Her son, Daniel. She wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the clock. They'd be here soon. Daniel and his wife, Rebecca. Margaret felt the familiar flutter of nervous anticipation in her chest. She wanted everything to be just right. The table was already set with her good china, the plates that had been a wedding gift 40 years ago. The flowers from her garden sat in a simple vase in the center. Nothing extravagant, just home. Margaret had never been one for extravagance, even when she could have afforded it. After Thomas died, she'd made deliberate choices about how to live. She kept the house they'd shared, with its worn but comfortable furniture and its walls full of memories. She drove the same reliable car she'd had for a decade. She shopped carefully, wasted nothing, and found her pleasures in books from the library and walks through the neighborhood where she'd raised her son. Some people might have called her lifestyle frugal. Margaret preferred to think of it as intentional. Thomas had taught her that, really. He'd been a man who valued substance over show, who measured success not in possessions but in the quality of one's character and the depth of one's relationships. She missed him every single day, but she carried his wisdom with her like a compass. The sound of a car in the driveway pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret untied her apron and smoothed down her simple cotton dress. Nothing special, just something comfortable she'd had for years. She made her way to the front door, her heart lifting at the prospect of seeing Daniel. When she opened the door, her son's familiar smile greeted her first. Daniel was 35 now, with his father's kind eyes and steady presence. He wrapped her in a hug that felt like coming home. "Hi, Mom," he said warmly. "Something smells amazing." "Just stew," Margaret replied, patting his cheek the way she'd done since he was small. "Nothing fancy." Rebecca appeared behind him, and Margaret's smile didn't falter, though she felt the subtle shift in atmosphere that always seemed to accompany her daughter-in-law. Rebecca was impeccably dressed as always, designer jeans that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month, a cashmere sweater in a shade of cream that looked like it had never seen a coffee stain, and a handbag that Margaret recognized from a magazine she'd flipped through at the dentist's office. Expensive. Very expensive. "Hello, Margaret," Rebecca said, offering a carefully made-up cheek for an air kiss. "Your garden looks quaint." Margaret accepted the greeting with grace. "Thank you, dear. The herbs are doing particularly well this year. Come in, come in. Dinner's almost ready." As they settled into the living room, Margaret couldn't help but notice Rebecca's eyes sweeping over the space with that familiar expression. Polite interest masking something else. Judgment, perhaps. Or pity. Margaret had seen it before in those small comments Rebecca made. The suggestions delivered as concern. "You know, Margaret," Rebecca said, settling into the armchair and crossing her legs elegantly. "I saw the most beautiful throw pillows at that new boutique downtown. They'd really brighten up this sofa. I could pick some up for you if you'd like." Daniel shot his wife a look, but Rebecca didn't seem to notice. "That's very thoughtful," Margaret replied calmly. "But I'm quite fond of these ones. Thomas's mother made them." "Oh." Rebecca's smile tightened slightly. "Well, they're certainly vintage." The word hung in the air like a polite insult. Margaret recognized it for what it was. Rebecca's way of saying old without quite saying it. But Margaret had learned long ago not to take offense at things that revealed more about the speaker than the subject. Rebecca was young. She still believed that new meant better, that value was determined by price tags and trends. Maybe she'd learn differently someday. Or maybe she wouldn't. Either way, Margaret wouldn't let it spoil her evening. Dinner proceeded with the usual small talk. Daniel spoke about his work. the projects keeping him busy, the stress of corporate life. Rebecca talked about her yoga classes, the spa she'd discovered, the new restaurant everyone was trying to get reservations at. Margaret listened, asked questions, and served generous portions of the stew she'd spent the afternoon preparing. After dinner, as dusk began to settle over the neighborhood, Margaret remembered she'd forgotten to pick the fresh rosemary she'd wanted to send home with Daniel. "It'll just take a moment," she told them, heading toward the back door. It was chilly outside. Autumn was settling in properly now, so Margaret grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. The coat, her beloved camel-colored wool coat that she'd worn for more years than she could easily count. It was soft with age, the fabric worn smooth at the cuffs and collar. To Margaret, it was like wearing a hug. It smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she kept in her closet, and beneath that, if she concentrated, she could still catch the ghost of Thomas's cologne. This coat had traveled with her through decades of her life. It had kept her warm through countless winters. It had been with her on the best day of her life and through some of the hardest. She slipped it on and stepped into her small garden, breathing in the cool evening air as she clipped fresh rosemary stems. Through the window, she could see Daniel helping clear the table and Rebecca standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, probably texting someone. When Margaret came back inside, arms full of fragrant herbs, Rebecca looked up from her phone and her eyes landed on the coat. For a moment, Rebecca's face registered something. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. And then she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly, but it wasn't kind either. "Margaret," Rebecca said, gesturing at the coat with her perfectly manicured hand. "Where on earth did you get that coat? It looks like something from a charity shop. Please tell me you're not still wearing that thing out in public." Margaret felt the words land like small stones against her chest. She saw Daniel freeze mid-motion, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Rebecca," he said quietly, a warning in his voice. But Rebecca continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension she'd created. "I'm just saying, Margaret, you should treat yourself. Get something new, something more current. I saw some lovely coats at Nordstrom last week. I could help you pick something out. My treat." Margaret stood very still, the rosemary stems still in her hands. She could feel the old familiar weight of the coat on her shoulders, could feel the history woven into every thread. She could have said so many things in that moment. She could have explained. She could have defended herself. She could have told Rebecca exactly what this coat meant and where it had come from. Instead, she simply smiled. A gentle, patient smile that came from years of choosing kindness over conflict. "That's very generous of you, Rebecca," Margaret said softly, moving to wrap the rosemary in newspaper for Daniel to take home. "But I'm quite attached to this old thing. It suits me just fine." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Daniel, a look that said what her words didn't. "Your mother is hopeless. She doesn't even realize how sad she looks." The rest of the evening passed quickly. Daniel hugged his mother extra tight when they left, and Margaret could feel his apology in the embrace. She patted his back reassuringly. She'd weathered worse than a daughter-in-law's thoughtless comments. She'd survived this too. But after they drove away, after she'd cleaned up the dishes and put away the leftovers, Margaret found herself standing alone in her bedroom, the coat draped over her hands. She ran her fingers over the soft wool, felt the weight of memory in the fabric. And for just a moment, sitting on the edge of her bed with the coat in her lap, Margaret allowed herself to feel the sting of Rebecca's laughter. Not because the coat was old, not because it wasn't fashionable, but because in dismissing this coat, Rebecca had dismissed something she couldn't see and didn't understand. She'd dismissed love. She'd dismissed memory. She'd dismissed all the invisible things that gave life its real meaning. Margaret folded the coat carefully and hung it back in her closet, right where it always lived, between her everyday jacket and her winter parka. In the morning, she'd feel better. In the morning, she'd remind herself that Rebecca was still learning. In the morning, she'd extend grace again, the way she always did. But tonight, just for tonight, she let herself feel sad. Margaret couldn't sleep. It was past midnight, but her mind kept circling back to the moment Rebecca had laughed. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was being too sensitive. But the heart doesn't always listen to reason, and hers felt bruised in a way she couldn't quite shake. Finally, she gave up on sleep. She pulled on her robe and padded back to her closet. There, hanging in its familiar spot, was the coat. Margaret took it down and carried it to her reading chair by the window. The streetlight outside cast a soft glow into the room, and she sat with the coat draped across her lap, her fingers tracing the seams. This coat had a story. And maybe, Margaret thought, it was time to remember it properly. It had been 1989. She and Thomas had been married for 27 years. They'd raised Daniel, put him through college, and finally found themselves with a bit of breathing room financially. Thomas's architecture firm had secured several major projects, and for the first time in their marriage, they had what people might call disposable income. Thomas had surprised her one evening in March, coming home with plane tickets to Paris. "Just the two of us," he'd said, his eyes sparkling with the kind of boyish excitement that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. 1 week. No schedules, no obligations, just us and the city we've always wanted to see. Margaret had cried. Not sad tears, joyful ones. They'd dreamed about Paris since they were newlyweds, but money had always been tight. There'd been Daniel's braces, the new roof they'd needed, Thomas's mother's medical bills. Life had a way of requiring practical choices, but finally, impossibly, they were going. The trip had been magical. They'd walked along the Seine, eaten croissants in tiny cafes, gotten lost in the winding streets of Montmartre. They'd held hands like teenagers, laughed at Thomas's terrible French, and taken photographs they'd later fill albums with. On their 4th day there, walking through the Marais district, they'd passed a boutique with beautiful coats displayed in the window. Margaret had paused, admiring a camel-colored wool coat. It was elegant but simple, with clean lines and beautiful detailing. She'd never owned anything quite like it. Thomas had noticed her looking. "Let's go in," he'd said. "Thomas, no," she'd protested. "It's bound to be expensive. We've already spent so much on this trip." But he'd taken her hand and pulled her inside anyway. That stubborn determination on his face that she knew meant there was no arguing with him. The shop was small, exquisite, smelling of leather and cedar. An elegant Frenchwoman had greeted them, and before Margaret quite knew what was happening, she was being fitted for the coat. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. She'd looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Someone sophisticated, worldly, cared for. "Thomas, look at the price," she'd whispered, showing him the tag. The number had made her breath catch. He'd looked at it, looked at her in the coat, and then smiled. "How often do we do this, Maggie?" he'd asked, using his special name for her. "How often do we get to be in Paris, in love, buying something beautiful? Let me give you this. Please." She'd tried to argue, but he'd already been reaching for his wallet. "Consider it an investment," he'd said, winking at the saleswoman. "My wife will wear this for decades. Cost per wear, it's practically a bargain." The Frenchwoman had smiled and carefully wrapped the coat in tissue paper, placing it in an elegant shopping bag with handles. "Madame," she'd said in accented English, "your husband is right. This is a coat for a lifetime. Hermès quality lasts forever." Margaret had heard the name, Hermès, but hadn't really understood what it meant. She'd known only that Thomas was looking at her with such love, such pride in being able to give her something special, that refusing would have hurt him. So she'd accepted the gift, kissed him in the middle of the shop, and worn the coat out into the Paris afternoon. They'd taken photographs that day. Thomas in his tweed jacket, Margaret in her new coat, both of them standing by the Seine with the Eiffel Tower in the distant background. Their faces were bright with happiness, with the rare luxury of being completely present in a perfect moment. For the rest of the trip, Margaret had worn the coat everywhere. It had kept her warm during their evening walks, had been her companion through museums and gardens and countless Parisian streets. And every time she'd put it on, she'd thought of Thomas's face when he'd bought it for her. That mixture of love and satisfaction, the joy of being able to give her something beautiful. When they'd returned home, the coat had hung in her closet like a talisman. She'd worn it to special occasions at first: gallery openings for Thomas's work, Daniel's college graduation, anniversary dinners. But as the years passed, it became simply part of her wardrobe. She loved how it felt, how it moved, how reliable and sturdy it was. She loved that it carried the memory of Paris in its very fabric. Thomas had been gone for 5 years now. Heart attack, sudden and devastating, stealing him from her on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The grief had been, still was, enormous. But she'd survived it by holding on to the memories, the tangible pieces of their life together. The house they'd shared, the garden he'd helped her plan. And yes, the coat. The beautiful camel-colored coat that he'd insisted on buying her during the best week of their lives together. Margaret held the coat closer now, sitting in her chair in the middle of the night. She brought it to her face and breathed in, searching for any remaining trace of him. The lavender was strong, but underneath, or maybe it was just her imagination, she thought she could still catch the faintest hint of his cologne. That spicy, woody scent that had been uniquely his. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room, to the coat, to the memory of the man who'd loved her enough to buy it. "I miss you so much, Thomas." The coat couldn't answer, of course, but holding it felt like being held. And sometimes that was enough. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her reverie. It was late for a text message. Margaret reached for her reading glasses and picked up the phone. It was from Daniel. "Mom, I'm so sorry about Rebecca's comment tonight. She didn't mean anything by it. You know how she is. Please don't be upset." Margaret's heart softened. Her son was a good man. He had his father's kindness, his father's careful way of trying to keep peace. She could picture him, lying awake in his own bed, worrying about her feelings. She typed back, "Sweetheart, I'm fine. Please don't worry. Get some sleep. I love you." A moment later, another text. "Love you too, Mom. Really, though, if you ever want to go shopping or anything, I'd be happy to take you. Just say the word." Margaret smiled sadly. Even Daniel didn't understand. He saw the coat as old, outdated, something his mother held onto out of mere stubbornness or frugality. He didn't know the story. She'd never told him, not in detail. Some memories felt too precious to share, too personal. This was hers and Thomas's. This coat, this story, this piece of their love. She texted back, "Thank you, honey, but I really am happy with what I have. Sleep well." She set the phone down and sat for a while longer with the coat, letting the memories wash over her. Paris in springtime. Thomas's laugh. The way he'd looked at her in that boutique, like she was the most beautiful thing in any city, in any world. Maybe Rebecca's laughter shouldn't have hurt so much. Maybe Margaret was being oversensitive. But it had hurt, and that was the truth of it. Not because of vanity or pride, but because Rebecca had mocked something sacred without even knowing it. She'd dismissed decades of love and memory with a careless laugh. Finally, as the clock crept toward 2 in the morning, Margaret rose and hung the coat carefully back in its place. She wouldn't explain herself to Rebecca. She wouldn't justify or defend. Some things were too precious for that. Some things you held close and protected, not because others couldn't understand, but because their understanding wasn't required. The coat would stay right where it was. And Margaret would keep wearing it, season after season, year after year, for as long as it lasted. Because it wasn't just a coat. It was love made tangible. It was a piece of Thomas she could still touch, and no amount of laughter or judgment would make her let that go. She climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up, finally feeling sleep begin to tug at her. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow always was. But tonight had been for remembering, and sometimes remembering hurt as much as it healed. Across town, Rebecca lay awake too, though for very different reasons. She was scrolling through Instagram, double-tapping photos of designer coats, planning her next shopping trip. The incident with Margaret's coat had already faded from her mind, just another small moment in a day full of moments, all of them quickly forgotten in the scroll of her perfectly curated life. She had no idea, none at all, what she'd actually laughed at that evening. How could she? She'd never thought to look deeper. She'd never learned that the most valuable things in life rarely announce themselves. They sit quietly in closets, waiting to be understood by those patient enough to ask their stories. But Rebecca would learn, eventually. Sometimes the most important lessons come not when we're ready for them, but when we finally stop long enough to see what's been in front of us all along. 2 weeks passed before Margaret saw Rebecca again. Life had returned to its comfortable rhythm. Morning walks, gardening, volunteering at the local library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Margaret had pushed the coat incident to the back of her mind, choosing to focus instead on the upcoming autumn. The leaves were turning, and she loved this season best of all. It reminded her of fresh starts, of change that was natural and beautiful rather than forced. She was in her garden, pruning her rose bushes, when she heard a car pull into the driveway. Margaret straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. It was Rebecca's white SUV, pristine and massive, the kind of vehicle that suggested someone was either very important or very insecure about their importance. Margaret tried to suppress the uncharitable thought. She'd been working on Grace lately. Rebecca emerged from the car wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying a large shopping bag from a boutique Margaret didn't recognize. Her daughter-in-law was smiling, that bright, enthusiastic smile that usually meant she'd had an idea she thought was wonderful. "Margaret," Rebecca called, her heels clicking on the driveway. "I'm so glad you're home. I have something for you." Margaret set down her pruning shears and pulled off her gardening gloves. "Hello, Rebecca. This is a surprise. Would you like some iced tea?" "Oh, no time. I have a yoga class in an hour, but I wanted to drop this off." Rebecca thrust the shopping bag toward Margaret with the eager energy of a child presenting a drawing to a parent. "I've been thinking about you, and I just couldn't resist. Open it." Margaret took the bag, feeling its weight, and a sense of dread settled in her stomach. She had a feeling she knew what this was. She reached inside and pulled out tissue paper, and beneath it, a coat. A new coat. Bright coral-colored, made of some kind of synthetic material that felt slippery and cold to the touch. It had oversized buttons and a trendy cut that Margaret knew would look ridiculous on her. "It's the latest style," Rebecca said, practically bouncing with excitement. "I saw it and thought of you immediately. That color would look amazing with your complexion. And the best part? It was on sale. Well, still expensive, but worth it. You'll look so much more modern, more current." Margaret held the coat at arm's length, examining it. It was the kind of thing Rebecca would wear, the kind of thing that would photograph well on social media. It was absolutely not the kind of thing Margaret would ever choose for herself. "Rebecca, this is very generous, but—" "Don't say but." Rebecca interrupted, her smile faltering slightly. "I want to do this for you. You've been so kind to us, and I just thought, well, you deserve something nice. Something new. You're always wearing such old things, and I know money's tight for you, so I thought I'd help out." There it was. The assumption. The pity masked as generosity. Margaret felt something harden in her chest, but her face remained calm. "Money isn't particularly tight," Margaret said gently, folding the coat carefully back into the bag. "And I appreciate the thought, but I really don't need a new coat. I have the one I prefer." Rebecca's face registered genuine confusion. "You mean that old brown thing?" Margaret seriously. "That coat has seen better days. It's practically falling apart. And honestly, it makes you look—" She trailed off, catching herself. But the damage was done. "Makes me look what?" Margaret asked quietly. "Well, old. It makes you look old. Like you've given up." Rebecca laughed, as if to soften the words, but they landed heavy and sharp. "Come on, Margaret. Let me give you this. Let me help you look younger, more pulled together. Daniel would love to see you in something fresh and new." Margaret stood there in her garden, the autumn sun warm on her shoulders, and felt the full weight of Rebecca's well-meaning condescension. This wasn't about generosity. This was about Rebecca's discomfort with Margaret's choices. Her inability to understand that someone might deliberately choose simplicity, might find value in old things. I'm going to decline, Margaret said, extending the bag back toward Rebecca. But thank you for thinking of me. Rebecca's smile vanished completely. I don't understand. Are you refusing a gift? I drove all the way over here to— I'm refusing a gift that comes with expectations, Margaret interrupted, more firmly than she usually spoke. Rebecca, I don't need fixing. I don't need to look younger or more modern. I'm happy with who I am and what I wear, including my old coat. For a moment, Rebecca just stared at her, and Margaret could see the war happening behind her eyes. Hurt pride, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment if she'd been capable of recognizing it. Fine, Rebecca said, snatching the bag back. Keep wearing your charity shop coat. See if I care. I was just trying to help, but if you want to look like a bag lady, that's your choice. The words were meant to wound, and they did. But Margaret had learned long ago not to let pain show, not to give people that power over her. I think perhaps you should go, Margaret said quietly. We can talk another time when we're both feeling calmer. Rebecca huffed, turned on her expensive heel, and stalked back to her SUV. She threw the shopping bag into the passenger seat with unnecessary force, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without another word. Margaret watched her go, then slowly bent to pick up her gardening gloves. Her hands were shaking. She sat down on the garden bench Thomas had built years ago, feeling suddenly tired. It wasn't the insult that bothered her most. It was the assumption behind it. That Margaret's life choices were somehow wrong, that simplicity meant poverty, that old meant worthless. She thought about the coat hanging in her closet, that beautiful, expensive, beloved coat that carried 35 years of memories. She thought about Rebecca seeing it and laughing, about Rebecca seeing her and finding her wanting. And for the first time, Margaret wondered if maybe she should tell the story. Maybe she should explain. Maybe if Rebecca knew. But no. She pushed the thought away. The truth was, it shouldn't matter whether the coat was designer or from a thrift store. Margaret's worth wasn't determined by labels or prices. Her life choices weren't up for judgment or correction. She'd learned that lesson decades ago, and she wasn't about to forget it now. That evening, Daniel called. Mom, Rebecca told me what happened. I'm sorry, she was just trying to be nice. I know she was, sweetheart, Margaret said, stirring the soup she was making for dinner. Just for one, which always felt slightly depressing. But I didn't need her to be nice in that particular way. Daniel sighed. She thinks you're being stubborn. She said you're too proud to accept help. Is that what she thinks? That I need help? Margaret felt a flash of something hot and unfamiliar. Anger, maybe, or frustration. Daniel, I'm fine. Better than fine. I live exactly the way I choose to live. I know, Mom. I know, but would it really hurt to let her do something nice? She's trying to connect with you. Maybe if you just accepted the coat, it would make her feel better. And what about making me feel better? The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. There was a long pause. What do you mean? Margaret closed her eyes. She'd never been one to complain or make demands, especially not of her son. But something in her had shifted. Maybe it was time to be a little less accommodating, a little more honest. Daniel, your wife laughed at my coat. Then she tried to replace it without ever asking if I wanted it replaced. She made assumptions about my financial situation, about my ability to care for myself, about my choices. And you're asking me to accept that behavior to make her feel better? Another pause, longer this time. Mom, I didn't think about it that way. I know you didn't, because you're trying to keep everyone happy, which I understand. But sometimes making everyone happy means someone gets hurt quietly. And lately, that someone has been me. She heard Daniel take a shaky breath. I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you more. At dinner, when she said that stuff about your coat, I should have said something stronger. Yes, Margaret agreed softly. You should have. Not because I need protecting, but because respect matters, even in families, especially in families. You're right. I'll talk to her. That's up to you. But Daniel, I love you very much. And I love that you want your wife and your mother to get along. But that can't happen at the expense of my dignity. Do you understand? I do. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. After they hung up, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table with her bowl of soup and felt something shift inside her. Standing up for herself had felt good. Uncomfortable, but good. She'd spent so much of her life smoothing things over, being understanding, making allowances. Maybe it was time to be a little less accommodating. That night, she took the coat out of her closet again. But this time, instead of sadness or hurt, she felt something different. Pride, maybe, or defiance. This coat had traveled across an ocean. It had witnessed one of the happiest weeks of her life. It had been chosen with love and worn with joy. It had lasted 35 years because it was beautifully made, because someone had cared about quality and craftsmanship. Rebecca's trendy coral coat would probably fall apart in a season or two. But this coat would outlast them all. Just like Margaret's memories, just like Margaret's strength. She hung it back in the closet, right where it belonged, and went to bed feeling more settled than she had in weeks. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight she'd stood her ground. And that was enough. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. It was Daniel, and the strain in his voice was immediately apparent. Mom, do you have a minute to talk? Margaret set down her book. It was Thursday evening, and she'd been enjoying a quiet night with a mystery novel and a cup of chamomile tea. But the tone of her son's voice made her stomach tighten with concern. Of course, honey. What's wrong? She heard him exhale slowly. I lost my job today. The company's doing layoffs. I'm one of 200 people they let go. Margaret's heart clenched. Oh, Daniel, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? I don't know. Maybe. Eventually. Right now I'm worried, Mom. The severance package is decent, but it's only 2 months' salary. And Rebecca and I have the mortgage, her car payment, credit cards. He trailed off, and Margaret could hear the fear beneath his words. Have you told Rebecca? Yeah. She's not handling it well. She keeps asking what we're going to do, how we're going to maintain our lifestyle. Like I have some backup plan I've been hiding. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I worked for that company for 9 years, Mom. I thought I was secure there. Margaret's mind was already calculating. She had savings, more than Daniel knew about, more than anyone knew about. After Thomas died, she'd made careful choices. She'd sold Thomas's half of the architecture firm to his partners for a fair price. She'd lived modestly on her Social Security and a small pension, letting most of Thomas's life insurance and the business sale money sit untouched, invested wisely. She'd always thought of it as her safety net, and maybe as something to leave to Daniel someday. But someday had just become today. How much do you need? She asked simply. What? No, Mom, I wasn't calling to ask for… Daniel, how much would help right now? To give you breathing room while you job hunt? She heard him struggling with the question, with his pride, with his worry. Mom, I can't take your money. You're living on a fixed income. I need my son to not lose his house. How much, Daniel? A long silence. Then, quietly, 15,000 would cover the mortgage and car payments for the next few months. Give me time to find something new. But Mom, that's too much. I can't… You can, and you will. Consider it an early inheritance, or a loan if that makes you feel better. I'll write you a check tomorrow. Mom, Daniel, let me do this. Let me help my son when he needs it. That's what family is for. She heard him crying then, trying to muffle it, and her heart broke a little. Her boy, her strong, capable boy who was still, in so many ways, the child who'd come to her with scraped knees and hurt feelings, believing she could fix anything. Thank you. he managed. Thank you, Mom. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Come by tomorrow and I'll have the check ready. And Daniel? This is temporary. You'll find something even better. I believe that. After they hung up, Margaret sat very still, staring at nothing. $15,000. It was a significant sum, but she could spare it. Thomas had provided well for her, and she'd been careful. The money was there, waiting for moments exactly like this. The next day, Daniel came by alone. He looked exhausted, his usual easy confidence dimmed by stress and uncertainty. Margaret made him lunch, wrote him the check, and sent him home with containers of soup and fresh bread. He hugged her hard before he left, whispering another thank you against her hair. Your father would be proud of you, Margaret told him. You're handling this with grace. That matters more than you know. After he left, Margaret returned to her quiet house and found herself thinking about Rebecca. She wondered how her daughter-in-law was processing this crisis. Rebecca's identity seemed so tied to their lifestyle, to the image they projected. How would she handle this disruption? The answer came 2 days later when Rebecca called. Margaret? It's Rebecca. I wanted to thank you for helping us out. Daniel told me about the check. Of course, dear. I'm happy to help. Rebecca paused, and Margaret could hear the vulnerability in her voice, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. I didn't know you had that kind of money saved. Daniel always said you lived pretty simply. I assumed... She didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret heard what she didn't say. I assumed you couldn't afford to help. I assumed you were poor. I do live simply, Margaret said gently. That doesn't mean I don't have resources. Right, yes, of course. Rebecca sounded flustered. Anyway, thank you. Really, this is going to save us. After they hung up, Margaret sat with her tea and thought about assumptions. About how people looked at her modest house, her old car, her worn coat, and made judgments about her circumstances. How they confused simplicity with poverty, contentment with resignation. The truth was, Margaret could have lived very differently if she'd wanted to. She could have bought a bigger house, driven a luxury car, updated her wardrobe every season. She'd had the means to do all those things, but she'd chosen not to because those things didn't matter to her. She'd learned somewhere along the way that accumulation wasn't the same as fulfillment. That less could actually be more. But Rebecca didn't understand that yet. To Rebecca, the $15,000 must have been a shock. Evidence that contradicted everything she'd assumed about her mother-in-law. Margaret wondered if this might shift something, if this might make Rebecca see her differently. Meanwhile, across town, Rebecca sat in her pristine living room, staring at nothing, feeling her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Daniel's job loss terrified her, but it was more than just the money. It was what it meant. Without his salary, they couldn't maintain the lifestyle she'd worked so hard to build. The yoga studio membership, the regular salon appointments, the shopping trips, the nice restaurants. All of it suddenly felt precarious. And Margaret of the shabby coat and outdated furniture, had $15,000 to spare. Just like that, without hesitation. Rebecca pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts, looking for someone to talk to, someone who would understand. But as she scrolled, she felt something uncomfortable stirring in her chest. A question she didn't quite want to answer. If Margaret had money all along, why did she live the way she did? What did Margaret know that Rebecca didn't? The thought was unsettling. It suggested that maybe, Rebecca had been wrong about some fundamental things. That maybe the measure of a life wasn't in how much you spent or how impressively you lived. That maybe there were different ways to be rich that had nothing to do with bank accounts. But Rebecca pushed the thought away. It was too uncomfortable, too challenging to everything she believed. Instead, she focused on the practical. They had breathing room now. Daniel would find a new job. Everything would go back to normal, except nothing would ever quite be normal again, though Rebecca didn't know that yet. Sometimes understanding comes slowly, like dawn creeping across a landscape, and sometimes it comes in a flash, sudden and undeniable. For Rebecca, understanding was still weeks away, but it was coming, inevitable as the changing seasons, patient as time itself. All it needed was the right moment, the right catalyst. All it needed was one small discovery that would change everything. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Rebecca started visiting Margaret more often. It began with thank you visits, stopping by with flowers, with a bottle of wine, with small gifts that felt like attempts at repayment. But gradually, the visits became something else. Rebecca would stop by on her way home from the grocery store or call to ask if Margaret needed anything picked up while she was out. Margaret was surprised by this new attention, but accepted it with her usual grace. She sensed that Rebecca was struggling with something, processing the recent upheaval in her life. Financial stress had a way of rearranging priorities, of making people reconsider what mattered. On a bright Saturday morning in November, Rebecca arrived with cleaning supplies. "I thought maybe I could help you with some housework," Rebecca offered, standing on Margaret's porch with a bucket of supplies and an uncertain smile. "You've done so much for us. Let me do something for you." Margaret was taken aback. Rebecca had never offered to help with anything practical before. "That's very thoughtful, but really, I manage just fine on my own." "I know, but please, I want to help." There was something almost desperate in Rebecca's voice, something that made Margaret step aside and let her in. "All right, thank you, dear. That's very kind." They worked together for a while, Rebecca cleaning windows while Margaret dusted shelves. It was oddly pleasant, this companionable silence. Rebecca seemed different somehow, less performative, less focused on maintaining her usual polished image. She'd come in yoga pants and an old t-shirt, her hair in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup. She looked younger this way, more real. "I need to run to the hardware store for more light bulbs," Margaret said after an hour. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen if you need a break." "Take your time," Rebecca said, spraying another window. "I've got this." Margaret gathered her purse and car keys, then paused at the closet by the front door. The camel coat hung there, right where it always did. She could have grabbed her lighter jacket. It wasn't that cold today. But habit was habit, and comfort was comfort. She reached for the coat. Behind her, she heard Rebecca's voice, sharp and surprised. "You're wearing that coat again?" Margaret turned, the coat already half on. Rebecca was standing in the doorway to the living room, spray bottle in hand, staring at the coat with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Is that a problem?" Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again. Margaret could see the war happening on her daughter-in-law's face, the urge to comment, to judge, warring with something else. Finally, Rebecca just shook her head. "No, no problem. Never mind. See you soon." Margaret left, and Rebecca stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the door. That coat. That ridiculous, outdated coat that Margaret insisted on wearing despite having enough money to buy dozens of new ones. Why? What was Margaret trying to prove? Rebecca returned to her cleaning, but the question nagged at her. She worked her way through the living room, the dining room, the kitchen. And then, without quite meaning to, she found herself back in the hallway, standing in front of the coat closet. She shouldn't. She knew she shouldn't. This was Margaret's private space, and she had no right to snoop. But the curiosity was overwhelming. What was so special about that coat? Rebecca glanced toward the window. No sign of Margaret's car yet. She'd be gone at least 15 more minutes. Enough time. She opened the closet door. The coat hung there, looking exactly as worn and unremarkable as Rebecca remembered. But she'd learned recently that appearances could be deceiving. Margaret had proven that. So Rebecca reached out and lifted the coat from its hanger, feeling its weight. It was heavier than she'd expected. And the fabric, when she looked closely, was actually quite beautiful. A soft, buttery wool that had aged well despite its years. The color was lovely, too. a warm camel tone that would complement almost any complexion. The construction was impeccable, the seams perfect, the lining intact. Rebecca's hands moved almost automatically, reaching for the label at the neck, just to see, just to check what brand it was, where it had come from. Maybe it was some vintage piece from a thrift store that Margaret had found years ago, some lucky find that... Her fingers found the label and she turned it toward the light. Hermes, Paris. Rebecca froze. She stared at the label, certain she was misreading it. Hermes. The Hermes, one of the most exclusive, expensive fashion houses in the world. The brand that her wealthy friends coveted, that she herself had only ever window shopped for, that represented a level of luxury she'd never quite been able to afford, despite all her designer handbag and carefully cultivated image. With shaking hands, Rebecca pulled out her phone and typed, "Vintage Hermes coat value." The results made her knees weak. Vintage Hermes coats, especially from the 1980s in good condition, regularly sold for thousands. $5,000, $10,000, sometimes even $15,000 for a single coat. This coat, this ugly, outdated, laughable coat that she'd mocked, was worth more than most of the clothes in Rebecca's closet combined. Rebecca sank onto the bench by the door, still holding the coat, her mind reeling. If Margaret owned a Hermes coat, if she had $15,000 to give away without hesitation, if she chose to live simply despite having resources, what else didn't Rebecca know? With trembling fingers, Rebecca opened her phone's browser and typed, "Margaret Wright," with Margaret's city name. She'd never thought to search for her mother-in-law before. Why would she? Margaret was just... Margaret, a sweet but dowdy woman who lived a small, simple life. Except the search results told a different story. There were old society page photos from the 1980s and early 1990s. Margaret, younger and elegant, standing beside a distinguished-looking man at charity galas, gallery openings, foundation events. The captions identified her husband as Thomas Wright, architect and philanthropist. Rebecca's hand shook harder as she clicked through to more results. Obituaries for Thomas, articles about his award-winning designs, mentions of donations the Wright family had made to various causes, references to Margaret serving on the boards of several nonprofit organizations. This wasn't the life of someone living on the margins. This was the life of someone who'd moved in circles Rebecca had only ever aspired to. Rebecca heard a car in the driveway and panic seized her. She quickly hung the coat back up, closed the closet door, and hurried to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She grabbed her spray bottle and started vigorously cleaning the counters, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Margaret came in through the back door, carrying a small bag from the hardware store. "I'm back. How's it going?" "Great." Rebecca's voice came out too loud, too bright. "Just finishing up the kitchen." Margaret studied her for a moment. Rebecca's face was flushed, her movements jerky and nervous. "Rebecca, are you all right? You look pale." "Fine. I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. I should probably head out, actually. Lots to do at home." She gathered her cleaning supplies quickly, barely making eye contact with Margaret. "Thanks for letting me help. I'll call you later." And then she was gone, leaving Margaret standing in her kitchen with a bag of light bulbs, wondering what on earth had just happened. Rebecca sat in her car in Margaret's driveway for a full 5 minutes before she could bring herself to start the engine. Her mind was spinning, trying to reconcile everything she thought she knew with what she'd just discovered. The coat wasn't just a coat. Margaret wasn't just a simple widow living on Social Security. The whole narrative Rebecca had constructed, the story she'd told herself about poor Margaret who needed help, who needed fashion advice, who needed Rebecca to bring some style and sophistication into her sad little life. All of it was wrong. Rebecca had been so certain she understood Margaret, and she'd been completely, embarrassingly wrong. Worse than that, she'd been condescending. She'd been pitying. She'd laughed at something worth thousands of dollars, mocked choices made by someone who actually understood value in a way Rebecca was only beginning to comprehend. Rebecca finally started her car and drove home, but she couldn't stop thinking about the coat. about the label, about everything it implied. When she walked into her own house, the house she and Daniel were now struggling to afford, everything looked different suddenly. The trendy furniture they'd bought on credit, the decorative objects chosen for Instagram worthiness rather than meaning, the closet full of clothes she'd worn once or twice before moving on to the next trend. How much had she spent over the years chasing an image? How much debt had they accumulated trying to look successful? And Margaret with her Hermes coat and her quiet generosity and her modest house full of meaning, understood something Rebecca was only now beginning to glimpse. The question was, what was Rebecca going to do with this knowledge? Rebecca couldn't sleep that night. She lay beside Daniel in their expensive bed, in their expensive bedroom, in the expensive house they could suddenly barely afford, and stared at the ceiling. Daniel had finally drifted off around midnight, exhausted from another day of job hunting and rejection. But Rebecca's mind wouldn't quiet. She kept seeing that label, Hermes, Paris. Those two words had detonated something in her understanding of the world. At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep. She crept downstairs to the living room, opened her laptop, and began to search in earnest. Margaret Wright, Thomas Wright Architect, she typed, and the results flooded in. There was so much. Thomas Wright hadn't just been an architect. He'd been a renowned architect. His firm had designed several of the city's most notable buildings, including the downtown library Margaret volunteered at. Rebecca clicked through articles, awards ceremonies, interviews. Thomas had been respected, sought after, successful. And beside him in many photos was Margaret, younger but recognizable. Margaret in elegant dresses at foundation dinners. Margaret cutting ribbons at building openings. Margaret serving on charity boards alongside the city's most prominent citizens. Rebecca found an article from a design magazine, dated 1987, featuring the Wrights' home. She recognized it immediately. It was Margaret's current house, but the photos showed it in its prime. Mid-century modern, carefully curated, filled with beautiful furniture and art. The article described the couple's aesthetic philosophy. Quality over quantity, intentional simplicity, spaces designed for living, not showing off. The furniture in those photos, Rebecca recognized some of it. It was still in Margaret's house, just older now. That outdated sofa Rebecca had wanted to replace? It was an Eames, that coffee table? Probably worth thousands. Rebecca's interior designer magazines had taught her enough to recognize good design when she saw it properly. She found Thomas's obituary from 5 years ago. It mentioned his survivors, his wife Margaret and son Daniel. It mentioned his distinguished career. And it mentioned that, in lieu of flowers, donations should be made to several causes: the public library system, a scholarship fund for architecture students, and a homeless shelter. Rebecca opened a new search tab: Thomas Wright estate value. She didn't find an exact number, but she found enough. The sale of his half of the architecture firm to his partners, the value of his designs and ongoing royalties, property holdings, investments. Thomas Wright had been, by any measure, a wealthy man, which meant Margaret was a wealthy woman. A wealthy woman who lived in a modest house, drove an old car, wore vintage clothes, and volunteered at a library. A wealthy woman who'd written a $15,000 check without hesitation, without making a big production of it, without expecting gratitude or recognition. A wealthy woman who Rebecca had pitied, laughed at, condescended to. Rebecca felt sick. She kept searching, driven by something between curiosity and self-flagellation. She found board minutes from charitable foundations where Margaret still served. She found thank you letters published in nonprofit newsletters, thanking Margaret Wright for her generous donations. She found Margaret's name on donor walls at museums, theaters, and community centers. Margaret wasn't just wealthy. She was quietly philanthropic. She gave away money regularly, substantially, to causes that mattered to her. And she did it all without fanfare, without social media posts, without using it to elevate her own status. Rebecca thought about her own charitable giving, the token donations she made at gala events, carefully documented with photos she could post online. Supporting important causes, the captions always said, beside pictures of her in designer dresses. She thought she was being generous, but compared to Margaret's steady, private giving, Rebecca's charity looked like exactly what it was: performance. Around 4 in the morning, Rebecca found something that made her stop breathing for a moment. It was a local newspaper article from 1989 in the Society section. The headline read, "Local couple returns from Paris with stories and style." There was a photo of Thomas and Margaret Wright standing on their front porch. Thomas wore a tweed jacket. Margaret wore a camel-colored coat, the same coat, the coat Rebecca had laughed at. The article was a light piece about prominent local couples and their vacation destinations. Margaret was quoted, "Paris was magical. We walked everywhere, talked for hours, and forgot completely about deadlines and obligations. Thomas surprised me with the most beautiful coat from a little boutique in the Marais. I intend to wear it forever." Rebecca stared at those last words. I intend to wear it forever. And she had. 35 years later, Margaret was still wearing that coat. Not because she couldn't afford a new one, not because she was too poor or too out of touch to update her wardrobe, but because that coat meant something. Because it carried a memory. Because love, real love, lasted longer than trends. Rebecca closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her living room, surrounded by all the expensive things she'd insisted they buy. The sectional sofa that had cost more than her first car. The abstract art she'd chosen because her favorite influencer had the same piece. The coffee table book she'd never read, arranged artfully for Instagram photos. Suddenly, all of it felt hollow. She'd spent years building an image, a life that looked impressive on the surface. But what did any of it mean? What memories were attached to these objects? What love? When Daniel's job loss had threatened their lifestyle, Rebecca had panicked because she'd built her entire identity on that lifestyle. She was a woman who wore designer labels, drove a nice car, lived in an impressive house. Without those things, who was she? But Margaret. Margaret had lost her husband, the love of her life, and hadn't let that loss diminish her. She'd kept what mattered and let go of what didn't. She'd chosen meaning over appearance, substance over show. And in doing so, she'd maintained a dignity that Rebecca suddenly desperately envied. Rebecca started crying then, sitting alone in her expensive living room at 4 in the morning. She cried for her own shallow understanding of the world. She cried for every condescending comment she'd made to Margaret, every pitying look, every moment of judgment. She cried because she was 32 years old and only now realizing that she'd been measuring success with the wrong ruler. When the sun finally came up, Rebecca was still sitting there, exhausted and red-eyed, but oddly clear-headed. She knew what she had to do. She had to talk to Margaret. She had to apologize. Really apologize, not just a quick, "sorry if I offended you," but a real admission of how wrong she'd been. But more than that, she had to learn. She had to understand how Margaret had figured out what Rebecca was only now beginning to see. That worth isn't worn on the outside. That value isn't determined by price tags. That a life well lived has nothing to do with keeping up appearances. Daniel found her there when he came downstairs at 7, still in her pajamas, laptop closed on the coffee table. "Babe, did you sleep here?" "I didn't sleep at all," Rebecca admitted. "Daniel, I need to tell you something. About your mom. About me. About everything." And as the morning light filled their expensive living room, Rebecca told him about the coat, the label, the research. She told him about her assumptions and her mistakes. She told him, crying again, about how ashamed she felt. Daniel listened, and when she finished, he took her hand. "My mom has never cared about impressing people," he said gently. "She and Dad taught me that. I guess I thought you understood that about her." "I didn't," Rebecca whispered. "I didn't understand anything. I saw what I expected to see. I saw someone I thought needed help, needed guidance, needed me to fix her. And all along, she was exactly who she wanted to be." Daniel finished. "She still is. How do I apologize for being so blind? So judgmental?" I think you start by being honest. Mom values honesty more than anything. Rebecca nodded, wiping her eyes. She would call Margaret today. She would go see her. And this time she would actually see her. Not the version she'd imagined, but the real woman. The woman who'd been there all along, waiting patiently for Rebecca to open her eyes. Sometimes understanding comes in a flash of insight, sudden and overwhelming. Rebecca had spent one sleepless night learning what Margaret had spent a lifetime knowing. And though she couldn't undo her past mistakes, she could at least acknowledge them. She could at least try to do better. It was a start. And sometimes a start is all we have to give. Rebecca sat in her car outside Margaret's house for 15 minutes before she found the courage to get out. It was Tuesday afternoon, and she'd called ahead, asking if she could stop by. Margaret had said yes, of course, in that warm, unhurried voice that now made Rebecca feel even worse about everything. Finally, Rebecca forced herself to move. She walked to Margaret's door and knocked, her heart hammering. Margaret answered almost immediately, wearing a simple cotton dress and an apron. She'd been baking. Rebecca could smell cinnamon and apples. "Rebecca, come in. I've just made an apple pie." Perfect timing. The kindness in Margaret's voice nearly undid Rebecca right there. She followed Margaret inside into the kitchen that suddenly looked different to her. Not outdated, but timeless. Not cheap, but unpretentious. Every object in this house had been chosen with intention, had been kept because it mattered, not because it impressed. Sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the kitchen table. "Tea?" "Please." Rebecca's voice came out small. They sat together, Margaret pouring tea into mismatched but beautiful cups that were probably vintage and probably expensive if you knew what you were looking for. Rebecca wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic and tried to find her words. "Margaret, I need to talk to you. I owe you an apology. A real one." Margaret set down her own cup and folded her hands, giving Rebecca her full attention. "All right, dear. I'm listening." Rebecca took a shaky breath. "When I was here the other day, cleaning, I shouldn't have, but I looked at your coat. I saw the label. Her mess. And then I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I looked you up. I Googled you and Thomas. I found articles, photos, information about his work, your donations, your life before. And I realized—" She stopped, fighting tears. Margaret waited patiently, not rushing her. "I realized that I've been completely wrong about you. About everything. I thought— God, this is so embarrassing to say out loud. I thought you needed my help. I thought you were this poor widow who didn't know how to take care of herself, who needed guidance on how to dress and live and look more put together. I pitied you. I judged you. And the whole time you are— I'm what?" Margaret asked gently. "You're everything I've been trying to look like, but without any of the substance. You're actually successful, actually generous, actually living a meaningful life. And I've been playing dress up, pretending to be something I'm not, judging you for being exactly who you are." Rebecca was crying now, the words tumbling out between sobs. "I laughed at your coat. Do you know how awful I feel about that? I laughed at something that's probably worth more than my car. But worse than that, I laughed at something that clearly means the world to you. I mocked something precious without even asking why it was precious. And I'm so, so sorry." Margaret let her cry for a moment, then reached across the table and took Rebecca's hand. Her touch was warm, steady. "Rebecca, look at me." Rebecca lifted her tear-stained face. "I knew you didn't understand," Margaret said quietly. "I knew you were making assumptions. But I also knew that you're young and that sometimes we learn these lessons the hard way. I wasn't angry with you. You should have been. I was awful. You were learning. You still are." Margaret squeezed her hand. "Can I tell you something? When I was your age, maybe a bit younger, I did something very similar. There was a woman in our neighborhood, Mrs. Chen. She wore the same clothes year after year, never updated her home, drove this ancient car. I felt sorry for her. I thought she must be struggling financially. Rebecca listened, sniffling. One day, my mother saw me looking at Mrs. Chen with that pitying expression. She pulled me aside and told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "Margaret, that woman has more money than our family will ever see. She also has more wisdom. She knows the difference between what matters and what doesn't. You'd do well to learn from her rather than judge her." "What happened?" Rebecca asked. I was mortified, of course, but it taught me a valuable lesson. I started actually talking to Mrs. Chen, listening to her stories, learning from her. She'd lived through the Depression, lost almost everything, and rebuilt her life. She knew, better than anyone I'd ever met, what truly had value. And it wasn't things. It was relationships, memories, experiences. It was love. Margaret paused, stirring her tea slowly. When Thomas and I built our life together, we tried to remember that. We had money. More than we needed, really. But we didn't let it define us. We lived well, but simply. We spent money on experiences we could share, on gifts that had meaning, on causes that mattered. Not on impressing people or keeping up with trends. "The coat," Rebecca said softly. "The coat," Margaret agreed with a smile. "Thomas bought it for me in Paris. It was our only trip to Europe. We'd finally saved enough, finally had time. We were in this boutique in the Marais district, and I'd been admiring it in the window. Thomas insisted. He said it was an investment in memories." Margaret's eyes were distant, soft with remembering. He was right. Every time I wear it, I'm back in Paris with him. I'm walking by the Seine, eating croissants in sidewalk cafes, laughing as he tries to speak French. That coat isn't valuable because of the label, Rebecca. It's valuable because Thomas chose it for me. Because it smells like him when I close my eyes and breathe deep. Because it's lasted through 35 years and thousands of memories. Rebecca was crying again, but quietly now. I didn't know. I didn't even think to ask. How could you? You'd been taught to value different things. Our society tells us constantly that new is better, that expensive means valuable, that appearances matter most. It takes time, and sometimes loss, to learn otherwise. But you've been so patient with me. Even when I was horrible, I never what? Lashed out? Corrected you harshly? Put you in your place? Margaret smiled gently. Rebecca, anger might have felt satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't have taught you anything. You weren't being malicious. You were being ignorant. And ignorance is cured by knowledge, not punishment. I don't deserve your kindness. None of us deserve all the kindness we receive. That's what grace is. Giving what isn't earned because it's needed anyway. Margaret poured more tea into both their cups. Besides, watching you discover these truths on your own is far more powerful than anything I could have told you. You had to see it for yourself. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their tea. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. Can you teach me? I don't need you to teach me about expensive coats or how to spend money. I mean, teach me what you know, about what actually matters, about how to live a life that means something instead of just looking like something. Margaret's face softened with genuine warmth. Oh, Rebecca, you're already learning. You're already asking the right questions. That's more than half the battle. I've wasted so much time, so much money. I've been so focused on the wrong things. You haven't wasted anything. You've been on a journey, and now you're in a different place on that journey. That's not waste. That's growth. Margaret paused thoughtfully. You know what matters most? It's simpler than you think. People over things. Memories over possessions. Quality over quantity. Being present over looking perfect. Love, real, deep, sustaining love, over everything else. Thomas loved you very much, Rebecca said, more statement than question. He did, and I loved him. That's the wealth I have, Rebecca. not the money in my account or the label in my coat. My wealth is in having been deeply loved, in having loved deeply in return, in having 40 years of memories I can revisit whenever I choose. That's what I have. That's what no one can take from me. Rebecca thought about Daniel, about their struggling marriage, about how focused she'd been on maintaining their image rather than nurturing what was real between them. I think I've been doing it all wrong, she whispered. With Daniel, with our life, I've been so worried about how things look that I forgot to notice how things feel. Then notice now, Margaret said simply. It's never too late to change course. Never too late to choose substance over show. Will you forgive me? For all of it? The comments, the code incident, the assumptions? Margaret reached across the table and cupped Rebecca's face gently, the way a mother might. Dear girl, I forgave you before you even asked. Now you need to forgive yourself. And then you need to do better. That's how grace works. They finished their tea together, and Margaret cut them both generous slices of apple pie. They talked about small things. The weather turning cold, Daniel's job search, the library's upcoming book sale. But underneath the mundane conversation was something new. Understanding, respect, the beginning of a real relationship built on honesty rather than assumption. When Rebecca finally left, she carried with her a container of leftover pie, a hug that felt like absolution, and a lesson she'd carry for the rest of her life. The most valuable things rarely have price tags. Worth isn't worn on the outside. And sometimes the people we most need to learn from are the ones we've been too blind to truly see. The weeks that followed Rebecca's confession brought changes that were subtle at first, then increasingly profound. Daniel noticed them before anyone else. The way Rebecca stopped scrolling through shopping apps during breakfast. How she'd started asking him about his day and actually listening to the answers. The quiet contentment that replaced her usual restless anxiety about what they should be doing, buying or becoming. One Saturday morning, Rebecca surprised him by suggesting they cancel their storage unit. The storage unit? Daniel looked up from his coffee, confused. Why? Because we're paying $200 a month to store things we never use and don't even remember we have. That's $2,400 a year for, what? Boxes of dishes we got as wedding gifts and never liked? Furniture that doesn't fit anywhere? Decorations for parties we never throw? Daniel set down his coffee. Are you feeling okay? Rebecca laughed. A real laugh, not the performative kind she'd perfected for social media. I'm feeling clearer than I have in years, actually. Let's go through it this weekend. Whatever we don't need, we donate. Whatever we want to keep, we find room for. But I'm done paying to store a life we're not actually living. They spent that Saturday and Sunday sorting through years of accumulated things. Rebecca was ruthless in a way that startled Daniel. The expensive dishes they'd never used? Donated. The trendy furniture that was too good to get rid of, but not good enough to actually use? Posted online for sale. The boxes of clothes with tags still on them? To the women's shelter Margaret volunteered with. This dress cost me $300, Rebecca said, holding up a cocktail dress she'd worn exactly once. $300 for 4 hours of feeling like I looked successful at a party where I didn't know anyone and spent the whole time worried about wine stains. That's $75 per hour to feel anxious. Daniel watched his wife fold the dress and place it in the donation pile, and something in his chest loosened. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with. Thoughtful, funny, real. Not the performance version she'd become somewhere along the way. What changed? He asked gently. Rebecca sat back on her heels, surrounded by boxes and piles of their former life. Your mom. That coat. Realizing that I've been measuring success completely backward. She looked at him, her eyes clear and honest. I've been so focused on looking like we have it all together that I didn't notice we were falling apart. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry for the pressure I put on us, on you, to maintain this image that didn't even make us happy. Daniel moved to sit beside her on the storage unit floor. I should have said something sooner. I felt it too. The pressure, the performance of it all. But I didn't know how to talk about it without sounding like I couldn't provide for you. Provide what? More stuff? More debt? More stress? Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder. Your mom gave us $15,000 without hesitation, and she lives in a house that probably hasn't been updated since the 90s. She drives a car from 2010. She wears a coat from 1989. And somehow she's richer than we'll ever be if we keep living like this. She is rich, Daniel said softly, just not in the way we've been defining it. They finished clearing the storage unit and saved $200 a month. Rebecca started volunteering at the library with Margaret, shelving books and helping with the children's reading program. She discovered she loved it. The quiet purposefulness of the work, the genuine gratitude people showed, the feeling of contributing something real rather than just posting about contributing. She also started cooking more, using Margaret's recipes and hand-me-down techniques. One evening, Margaret came for dinner. The first time Rebecca had invited her without it being a formal, stressful occasion. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, vegetables from the farmer's market, homemade bread. They ate at the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room, used everyday dishes instead of the fine china, talked and laughed without anyone performing. As Margaret was leaving, Rebecca walked her to her car. The November air was crisp, and Margaret had worn the coat. Rebecca looked at it, really looked at it, and saw what she'd been blind to before. The beautiful color, the impeccable construction, the way it moved with Margaret's body, soft and familiar, the love woven into every thread. "It's a beautiful coat," Rebecca said. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." Margaret smiled and pulled Rebecca into a hug. "You see it now. That's what matters." Over the following weeks, Rebecca found herself naturally gravitating away from the habits that had defined her for so long. She deleted her shopping apps. She unfollowed the influencers who made her feel inadequate. She stopped saying yes to expensive social events she didn't actually enjoy. She started saying yes to coffee with Margaret, to walks in the park, to quiet evenings at home with Daniel. The transformation wasn't always smooth. Some days, old anxieties would creep back. The fear that she wasn't enough without the trappings she'd relied on. The worry that people would think less of her. The shame of past extravagance. But Margaret was always there, patient and steady, reminding her that growth was a process, not an event. One afternoon, Rebecca and Margaret were having tea at a small cafe near the library when they ran into one of Rebecca's old friends, Chelsea, who Rebecca had always tried to impress and compete with. "Rebecca, oh my God, I haven't seen you in months." Chelsea air-kissed her, then looked critically at Rebecca's simple jeans and sweater. "What happened to your Burberry coat? And where did you get that?" She gestured vaguely at Rebecca's outfit with thinly veiled judgment. In the past, Rebecca would have felt ashamed, would have made excuses, would have promised to text about getting together for shopping soon. But now, with Margaret sitting calmly beside her, Rebecca felt something different. Not defensiveness, not embarrassment, just clarity. "I returned it," Rebecca said simply. "Turned out I didn't need it. Chelsea, this is my mother-in-law, Margaret." Chelsea barely glanced at Margaret, clearly dismissing her as unimportant based on her modest appearance. "Well, we should catch up soon. I'm heading to that new boutique everyone's talking about. You should come." "I don't think so," Rebecca said, surprising herself with how easy the words came. "But thank you for asking." Chelsea blinked, confused by this new version of Rebecca who didn't jump at the chance to shop and spend. "Oh, okay. Well, text me sometime." After she left, Rebecca turned to Margaret. "I used to think friendship with Chelsea meant something, but all we ever did together was shop and complain about other people. That's not friendship. That's just performance partnership. You're learning to tell the difference between people who want you and people who want what you can do for them," Margaret said. "That's wisdom, Rebecca. Hard-earned and valuable." Rebecca thought about that often in the weeks that followed. She thought about it when other old friends stopped reaching out once they realized she wasn't going to be their shopping companion anymore. She thought about it when she chose to spend a Friday night cooking dinner with Daniel instead of going to an expensive restaurant to see and be seen. She thought about it when she woke up on Saturday mornings and felt peaceful instead of anxious about all the things she needed to buy, do, or prove. Daniel got a new job. Not as prestigious or as high paying as his old one, but steadier, with better work-life balance and less stress. They celebrated with a bottle of wine from the grocery store and takeout pizza, sitting on their back porch and watching the sunset. "I'm happier than I've been in years," Daniel said, reaching for Rebecca's hand. "Me too," she admitted. "Isn't that strange? We have less money, less stuff, less of everything we thought mattered. And somehow we have more." "We have what my mom's had all along," Daniel said. "We have what actually matters." Margaret, for her part, watched Rebecca's transformation with quiet satisfaction. She'd seen this pattern before. People who'd lost their way finding it again. People who'd been chasing the wrong things finally turning toward what was real. It reminded her of her own journey, years ago, when Mrs. Chen had taught her to see beyond surfaces. One evening, sitting alone in her house with her journal open, Margaret wrote, "Rebecca is becoming who she was meant to be. The facade is cracking away, revealing something genuine underneath. I'm proud of her, not because she's become more like me, but because she's becoming more like herself, the self that existed before the world told her who to be." She closed the journal and looked around her modest living room. Nothing had changed here. Same furniture, same photographs, same quiet life. But the house felt fuller somehow, richer with new relationship, with teaching given and received, with the satisfaction of watching someone else learn what had taken Margaret years to understand. Change was possible. Growth was real. And sometimes, all it took was one moment of clarity, one glimpse behind a label, one night of uncomfortable truth, one patient teacher, to shift someone's entire trajectory. Rebecca had been given that moment, and she'd had the courage to do something with it. That, Margaret thought, was perhaps the most valuable thing of all. 6 months later, spring was painting the world in soft greens and pastel blossoms. Margaret stood in her garden, planting tomatoes and basil, when she heard the familiar sound of a car in her driveway. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and smiled as she saw Daniel and Rebecca walking toward her. But something was different. There was an ease between them now, a lightness that had been missing before. Rebecca wore simple jeans and a cotton sweater. Nothing designer, nothing showy, but somehow she looked more beautiful than Margaret had ever seen her. Happy. That was the difference. Rebecca looked genuinely happy. "Mom," Daniel called, wrapping her in a hug. "We brought lunch. Hope you're hungry." "Starving, actually. Perfect timing." They set up on Margaret's back porch, the same porch where Rebecca had once felt sorry for Margaret's outdated outdoor furniture. Now Rebecca just saw what it was. Comfortable chairs, a sturdy table, a peaceful space for sharing meals and conversations. Rebecca had brought homemade chicken salad, fresh bread from the bakery, and a fruit salad she'd made herself. No expensive takeout, no trendy restaurant containers, just simple, thoughtful food. As they ate, Rebecca talked about her volunteer work at the library, about the children's program she was helping expand, about the grant proposal she'd helped Margaret write to fund new books for underserved neighborhoods. The director asked if I'd consider coming on part-time. Rebecca said, her eyes bright. "It's not much money, but it would be official. A real position." "That's wonderful." Margaret reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You'd be excellent at it." "I never thought I'd be excited about a job that barely pays," Rebecca admitted. "But I am. It feels meaningful in a way nothing else I've done has felt." Daniel watched his wife with obvious pride. He'd found a new job 3 months ago. Solid, stable, less stressful than before. They'd refinanced their mortgage, paid down their credit cards, and built up a small emergency fund. They weren't wealthy by any measure, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were content. After lunch, Margaret brought out a photo album. Something she rarely did, but she'd been feeling nostalgic lately. "I wanted to show you something," she said, opening to a page from 1989. There they were, Thomas and Margaret, Young and radiant, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Margaret wore the coat. Rebecca looked at the photograph for a long time. You both look so happy. We were. That was one of the best weeks of my life. Margaret touched the photo gently. Thomas wanted everything to be perfect. He planned for months, saved up, read guidebooks. He'd always dreamed of taking me to Paris. Tell us more, Daniel said softly. He'd heard some stories, but never the full depth of that trip, of what it had meant. So Margaret told them about the tiny hotel with windows overlooking a cobblestone street, about getting lost in the metro and ending up in neighborhoods they'd never planned to visit, about the boutique in the Marais, and Thomas's insistence on buying her the coat, about how they'd laughed and walked and fallen in love all over again in a city that seemed designed for romance. I've never been able to part with this coat, Margaret said, because every time I wear it, I'm with him again. I can hear his voice, feel his hand in mine, remember the way he looked at me when he said, "This one, Maggie. This is the one." He knew somehow that this coat would last, that I'd still be wearing it decades later, still carrying those memories. Rebecca was crying quietly. I'm so sorry I laughed at it. I'm so sorry I didn't understand. You understand now, Margaret said simply. That's what matters. They spent the afternoon on the porch, talking and laughing as the day grew warm and lazy around them. At one point, Margaret went inside to use the bathroom, and when she came back, she'd put on the coat. Not because it was cold, but just because she'd wanted to wear it, to feel it around her shoulders. Rebecca looked up and saw her, and this time, what crossed her face wasn't judgment or pity or confusion. It was understanding, recognition, respect. That coat suits you, Rebecca said quietly. It's perfect on you. Margaret smiled, a full, genuine smile that made her eyes crinkle. Thank you, dear. I've always thought so. Later, as Daniel and Rebecca were getting ready to leave, Rebecca suddenly turned to Margaret. Would you teach me? Not about expensive things or designer labels, but about this. About building a life that matters, about knowing what to keep and what to let go of, about being content. Margaret took both of Rebecca's hands in hers. You're already learning it, sweetheart. You're already doing it. Every choice you make now, every time you choose meaning over appearance, substance over show, that's the lesson. You don't need me to teach you. You just need to keep doing what you're doing. But I want to learn from you. I want to understand how you've managed to live with such grace, such certainty about what matters. Grace isn't certainty, Margaret said gently. It's choosing kindness even when you're uncertain. It's extending patience to others because you know you need it extended to you. It's recognizing that everyone is fighting battles you can't see, carrying burdens you don't know about. And as for knowing what matters, she gestured around her modest home, her simple garden. That just takes time and loss and love. You figure it out by living, by making mistakes, by paying attention to what actually fills you up versus what just fills time. Rebecca hugged her tightly. Thank you for being patient with me, for not giving up on me when I was awful. You were never awful. You were learning. We're all always learning. After they left, Margaret stood in her garden again, watching the sun begin its descent. She thought about Rebecca's transformation, about the journey from judgment to understanding. She thought about her own journey, years ago, learning similar lessons. She thought about how wisdom gets passed down, not through lectures or demands, but through patient example and grace-filled correction. Inside, her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Thank you for today. Thank you for everything. I'm grateful to know you, really know you. Margaret smiled and typed back. The feeling is mutual, dear. See you soon. She set down her phone and touched the coat she was still wearing, feeling the familiar, soft wool beneath her fingers. Thomas would have liked Rebecca, she thought. He would have seen past the surface performance to the genuine person underneath. He'd always been good at that, seeing people as they were and as they could become. She's learning, Thomas. Margaret whispered to the evening air, to the memory of her husband, to the love that still felt present even 5 years after his death. She's going to be just fine. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Margaret stood in her garden, wrapped in her coat, wrapped in memories, wrapped in the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, people could change. They could grow. They could learn to see beyond surfaces to the substance underneath. And when that happened, when someone's eyes finally opened to what really mattered, it was worth every moment of patience it had taken to get there. Every awkward dinner, every thoughtless comment, every misunderstanding, all of it led to this: genuine relationship, real respect, mutual understanding. Margaret went inside as the last light faded from the sky. She made herself a cup of tea, settled into her favorite chair, and picked up her book. The house was quiet around her, filled with the comfortable silence of a life well lived, of choices well made, of love well remembered. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, Margaret was content. Tonight she had exactly what she needed. And really, she thought, turning the page of her book, what more could anyone ask for? Outside, the evening deepened into night. Inside, a woman sat reading by lamplight, wearing a 35-year-old coat, carrying decades of memories, holding wisdom earned through years of living intentionally. And somewhere across town, a younger woman lay awake thinking about labels and worth and the difference between price and value, beginning to understand that the most important lessons in life can't be bought. They can only be learned. 2 years passed. Spring turned to summer, turned to fall, turned to winter, and back again, the seasons marking time's passage in the most natural way. Life continued its steady rhythm, and with each passing month, the changes in Rebecca became less novelty and more simply who she was. Margaret was 64 now, still volunteering at the library, still tending her garden, still living her quiet, intentional life. She'd watched with deep satisfaction as Rebecca and Daniel built something real together. Not the performance marriage they'd had before, but something genuine and strong. They'd sold their too-large house and bought a smaller one closer to Margaret's neighborhood. They'd learned to cook together, to find joy in simple pleasures, to measure success by their peace of mind rather than their possessions. And then, one crisp October afternoon, Rebecca called with news. "Margaret, can you come over? Daniel's making dinner and I have something to tell you. Something important." Margaret heard the tremor of emotion in her daughter-in-law's voice and felt a flutter of anticipation. "Of course, dear. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She put on the coat. Autumn had arrived properly now, and she needed its warmth. As always, slipping into it felt like being embraced by memory. She'd worn this coat for 36 years now. Every thread held a story. When she arrived at Rebecca and Daniel's home, they were both waiting at the door, faces bright with barely contained joy. "We're pregnant," Rebecca said, the words tumbling out before Margaret was even fully inside. 12 weeks, everything looks good. We're having a baby, Margaret. You're going to be a grandmother." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Happy tears, the kind that come when life circles back to renewal and hope. She hugged them both, holding tight to these two people she loved so deeply. "Oh, this is wonderful. Wonderful. Your father would be over the moon, Daniel." They spent the evening talking about names and nurseries and all the hopes that come with expecting a child. At one point, Rebecca said something that caught Margaret's attention. "I want to teach our daughter or son what you taught me, about value and worth, about what really matters." "You will," Margaret assured her. "Not because you lecture them, but because you'll show them. Children learn from what they see us do far more than what we hear us say." That night, back in her own quiet house, Margaret sat at her desk and pulled out her journal. She'd been thinking lately about legacy, about what she wanted to leave behind when her own time came. Not material things, those were secondary, but wisdom, understanding, the lessons she'd learned and wanted to pass on. She began to write. "My dear Daniel, If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't be sad for too long. I've lived a full and beautiful life, rich with love and meaning. But before I go, I want to make sure you understand a few things. Your father and I built our life together on a foundation of values that sometimes ran counter to what society told us we should want. We could have lived more lavishly, spent more freely, impressed more people. But we chose differently because we learned early that happiness doesn't come from accumulation. It comes from connection, from purpose, from knowing what truly matters and protecting it fiercely. I'm leaving you the house, such as it is. I'm leaving you whatever money remains, though I hope I've given most of it away to causes that matter before this letter reaches you. I'm leaving you photographs and memories and hopefully the example of a life lived with intention. But more than anything, I'm leaving you this reminder. Measure your life by love, not by possessions. Measure your success by peace, not by wealth. Measure your worth by who you are when no one's watching, not by what you wear when everyone is. Rebecca has learned this. She's become a remarkable woman, not because she changed who she was, but because she found who she'd been all along beneath the performance. Your children will learn it from both of you. And maybe, if I've done my job right, these lessons will ripple forward through generations, each one teaching the next that true wealth can't be purchased. I love you, my son. I loved your father. I love the life we built together and the legacy we're passing on. Don't mourn me too long. Just remember me. And keep wearing coats, literal or metaphorical, that carry meaning, not just labels. All my love, always. Mom Margaret sealed the letter and placed it with her important documents, where Daniel would find it someday. Then she sat back, feeling the weight of years and wisdom, of lessons learned and taught, of love given and received. 10 years later, Rebecca stood in Margaret's old house, her and Daniel's house now. Margaret had passed peacefully 3 years earlier at 67, sitting in her garden on a warm spring afternoon. She'd simply closed her eyes and stopped breathing, as naturally as falling asleep. It had been, everyone agreed, exactly how she would have wanted to go. The house hadn't changed much. Rebecca and Daniel had kept most of Margaret's furniture, her books, her photographs. They'd added their own touches, children's artwork on the refrigerator, toys scattered in corners. But the essence of the place remained. Margaret's spirit still filled these rooms. Rebecca's daughter Emma was 7 now, curious and bright, with Daniel's kind eyes and Margaret's quiet wisdom already beginning to show. Today, Emma had come home from school upset. "A girl in my class said my jacket was ugly," Emma told her mother, tears threatening. "She said her mom bought her a better one and that I should ask you for something nice." Rebecca felt the old familiar sting, not for herself anymore, but for her daughter. She knelt down to Emma's level. "Come with me, sweetheart. I want to show you something." She led Emma upstairs to the closet where Margaret's things were carefully preserved. There, hanging in its place of honor, was the coat. The beautiful camel-colored Hermes coat that had started it all. "This was Grandma Margaret's coat," Rebecca said, taking it down carefully. "Do you remember her?" "A little," Emma said. "She was nice, she smelled like flowers." She was very nice and very wise. This coat was special to her, not because it was expensive, though it was. Not because it had a fancy label, though it does. But because Grandpa Thomas, who she loved very much, bought it for her during the happiest week of her life. Rebecca sat on the floor with the coat in her lap, Emma beside her. "When I first met Grandma Margaret, I made a big mistake. I laughed at this coat. I thought it was old and ugly. I judged it without knowing its story." "Why?" Emma asked. "Because I hadn't learned yet what Grandma Margaret knew. That the most valuable things in life aren't the things that look impressive. They're the things that mean something. This coat meant love. It meant memories. It meant a lifetime of choosing what mattered over what looked good." Emma touched the soft wool carefully. "It's pretty." "It is. But more than that, it's meaningful. Do you understand the difference?" Emma thought about it, her young face serious. Pretty is just how something looks. Meaningful is how it makes you feel? Exactly. Rebecca hugged her daughter. So when that girl at school said your jacket was ugly, what she was really saying was that she doesn't understand the difference yet between expensive and valuable, between new and meaningful. That's okay. She'll learn, like I did. But you already know something important. Your jacket keeps you warm. It works perfectly fine, and you don't need a different one just because someone else thinks you should. Emma nodded slowly. Grandma Margaret taught you that? She did. She was very patient with me while I learned. And now I'm going to be patient with you while you learn. And someday you'll be patient with your own children. Can I keep Grandma's coat someday? Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, sweetheart. When you're older, it's yours. Because by then you'll understand not just that it's valuable, but why it's valuable. And that makes all the difference. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Rebecca and Daniel sat in the living room, Margaret's living room, and talked about their day. Emma asked about the coat. Rebecca told him. I told her the story. All of it? Enough. She'll understand more as she gets older. But I think she gets the basics. That things matter because of what they mean, not what they cost. Daniel looked around the room. Mom would be proud of us, of how we're raising Emma, of how you've become. I'm who I should have been all along, Rebecca said. Margaret just helped me find my way back to it. They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by furniture that had stories, photographs that held memories, a life built on foundation of what mattered. Outside, autumn leaves were falling, marking time's passage. Inside, a family was building a legacy, not of wealth or status, but of wisdom and love and understanding that true value couldn't be purchased. The coat hung in its closet upstairs, waiting for Emma to grow up enough to wear it, to understand it, to carry forward the lessons woven into its fabric, waiting to be loved again by another generation, waiting to prove, once more, that the most precious things in life are the things we pass down, not because they're expensive, but because they're meaningful. And somewhere, in memory, in spirit, in the wisdom that echoes through time, Margaret smiled. Her legacy wasn't in money or possessions. It was in Rebecca's transformation, in Emma's growing understanding, in a coat that would keep teaching long after she was gone. It was in the simple, profound truth that she'd spent a lifetime learning and teaching. Worth isn't worn on the outside. Value isn't determined by price tags. And a life well lived is measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we understand, what we give, and who we love along the way. The coat would endure. The lessons would ripple forward. And Margaret's quiet, intentional legacy would live on. Not in monuments or possessions, but in hearts and minds and the choices people made because she'd shown them a better way. That was wealth. That was success. That was everything that truly mattered. And it couldn't be bought at any price.